Welcome to EMBARGOED, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm your host, Tim O'Toole, and with me today are two of our regulars. First is Collmann Griffin from our office in Washington, D.C. Welcome back to the pod, Collmann.
Hey, Tim. Hey, folks.
And also with us today is Tobias Ackermann from the BLOMSTEIN office in Berlin. And this has been a constant source of reader questions, Tobias. Which is it? Is it Tobias or is it Tobias? Because we've got to set the record straight before we get started.
It's Tobias.
Tobias. All right.
But I'm fine with either option.
No.
Thanks for having me again.
We'll use the correct option, and it's really great to have you back. So we're taking advantage of the fact that Tobias is in our Washington office to pick his brain today on some of the growing divergence between EU and US sanctions. So prior to 2025, so between 2022 and 2024, US and EU sanctions were very aligned with respect to Russia. At the outset of the Russian conflict, the EU, the US, the UK got together and really came into huge alignment on sanctions policy. In the past year, that has changed a little bit, really, since the beginning of 2025. The US sanctions policy has really been kind of frozen in place, whereas the EU sanctions policy has continued to evolve. And so what we wanted to talk about today with Tobias and also with Collmann is kind of where we stand now and some of the areas of divergence and why they should matter to U.S. persons, but also to folks in the EU. So why don't you start off, Tobias, and talk a little bit about some of the changes that have happened in 2025, and then we'll drill down on kind of what those mean.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. So the EU has kept pressure on Russia and adopted 3 sanctions packages alone since the beginning of the year. The 16th, the 17th, and the 18th package since the start of the war. And a 19th package is already on its way. So the European Commission has already showed some details on what they're planning to do. And we can talk about that later. But first about the sanctions that are now in place. We have seen a lot of focus on the issue of circumvention. So the EU is very much looking to fill a bit of the gap, at least, left by the United States when it comes to enforcing sanctions also beyond its own borders. So what we've seen is that the EU has, for example, targeted companies and vessels from third states other than Russia. They have sanctioned them. And we've also seen other kind of mechanisms that also concern potential diversion of goods to Russia. So, for example, we have seen that the EU has targeted the Russian infrastructure. They have imposed, for example, a full transaction ban on some airports in Moscow, regional airports in Russia, and 5 ports, because these facilities, the EU noticed, were used to circumvent especially the oil price gap. So as the listeners might know, the EU, together also with the United States, has imposed an oil price gap on Russian oil. So Europeans are banned from buying Russian oil completely, but of course there are third state operators that still want to buy Russian oil. And here the EU says if the oil is purchased under a certain threshold, then the EU operators are still allowed, for example, to insure the transaction and to provide services. But if the Russian oil is too expensive, so to speak, these services are all banned. And we've seen that this oil price cap is really circumvented heavily by the Russians, and thus the EU's attempts to restrict these circumventions.
So, as I understand it, it's basically airports and certain ports that the EU believes are being used to circumvent kind of the price cap allowed diversion. So, essentially, these pieces of infrastructure are now under transaction bans by the EU. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Plus, we have over 150, close to 200 now, I think, vessels that are listed as part of Russia's so-called shadow fleet. But that's only one of the measures taken by the EU to fight the circumvention and diversion of Russian goods.
And these are all, in 2025. So we've started with kind of logistics measures and measures that kind of the mechanics of circumvention. Let's talk a little bit about, maybe some of the products that have been of concern. I know that there have been restrictions on import and purchase of Russian origin goods, the aluminum sector and at least some Russian petroleum. Why don't you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, sure. So the import bans have been in place since the very beginning of the sanctions, but they have been broadened continuously. As you said, we've seen Russian primary aluminum now being sanctioned. Another, I think, for European operators, very impactful measure is is what happened in the July package this year. So there was a new import ban on actually third state petroleum products, not Russians, if these products were in turn refined using Russian crude oil. So normally we would say, and I believe that the US treats it similarly. So if you have an import ban on Russian goods, this ceases to apply if the Russian product is somehow changed in a third country, right? So if you have crude oil from Russia being refined, for example, in India, then the petroleum product is not sanctioned because it is no longer a Russian product, but an Indian product, and we do not sanction Indian products. Now, the EU has made an exception to this rule already with respect to iron and steel products, and now it has adopted as a parallel prohibition on petroleum products, and that will only come into application starting in January next year. And I guess that's also kind of helpful for companies because they now need to screen their supply chains. They need to ask their suppliers for some kind of evidence of the origin of the crude oil that is used for the products. Because when importing such goods from third countries into the EU, they will, starting 21st of January, they will have to show to the customs authorities some kind of evidence of the origin. So this is a huge burden on European operators, of course, but is quite important to follow that. Otherwise, you will have problems importing the goods into the EU.
And it's a big change. I mean, I think, at least as I understand it, this is kind of originally, I think the coordinated policy with respect to Russian oil was that there would be a price cap, and that the price cap would essentially fix this because if, say, India was purchasing Russian oil for a price under the price cap, then that would have the effect of kind of lowering the price of Russian oil. And then if India then, if that oil was substantially transformed into, say, gasoline in India or some other country, then the price cap would still be effective because India was buying under the price cap. I'm assuming, and I'm going to throw this over to Collmann, that the reason that the EU and also the US, this is one area that I think the US has at least arguably jumped into because President Trump imposed tariffs, exceptionally high tariffs on India. And the stated reason for doing that was the evasion of the price cap. I mean, Collmann, is this kind of amping up of sanctions on Russian petroleum, is that kind of moving away from the price cap, or is it kind of a supplement to the price cap?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think your understanding of the policy is exactly right, Tim. The only color I would add is that there was also sort of a policy rationale for having as much of the value add to a refined petroleum product take place outside of Russia. So the refining into gasoline or whatever, if that takes place outside of Russia, the economic benefit accrues to India. But I think I suspect that that price cap enforcement is always a topic of heated debate, and I suspect that the folks in the EU are not happy with the sort of enforcement results, and so they're considering measures like this. I do want to add, this is a little bit of an aside, but the U.S. has taken a similar measure, sort of not applying the substantial transformation to a Russian origin product, but whether the raw material comes from an Russian origin product for one good, and not to put you both on the spot, but I'm wondering if you can guess what it is.
Good. Oh,
one
man.
Russian origin product that, even if it's substantially transformed, is still prohibited.
Well, I'm going to take a wild guess because I don't know the answer, but is it steel?
No, it's fish.
Ah, how would you do that?
It's in an FAQ 1155. I've heard this within OFAC referred to as the quote-unquote fish stick problem. And essentially you can catch a fish in Russia, and you can substantially transform it into a fish stick in China, and it's still prohibited for import in the United States. And sort of a little bit of inside baseball here, I think this is one of the unusual areas where OFAC policy is influenced by domestic economic considerations, and the two senators from Alaska, and the importance of the fishing industry in that state.
That's wild.
It is a model if the U.S. ever wanted to do it for oil.
Yeah, I mean, and it sounds like that's really what the EU is turning to as well, and so we can see from the EU. Tobias will come back in a couple of months and tell us how this is working after it takes effect in January, and maybe provide a roadmap for next steps. Although, from what I'm reading, President Trump has suggested that the EU should just go straight out and ban any sort of imports of Russian oil, not just substantially transformed, but altogether, which I don't think the EU has done yet. Is that right, Tobias?
So what we have seen is that especially the import of LNG has been quite substantial from the EU so far, and they have now, I guess, in kind of hearing this claim from the White House, they have now agreed to accelerate the process of exiting from the Russian LNG market. So they will, starting 2027, 1 year earlier than originally anticipated, ban all LNG imports. So, yeah, and
was that prompted by kind of calls from President Trump, or was that kind of independently on its way before he started making calls?
I think the timeline has shifted because of Donald Trump's claim for that. Yes, and we have seen that the EU also wanted to originally adopt the 19th package earlier than it now seems to be adopted, because they wanted to coordinate with the US administration.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but basically the 19th package is the one that was proposed, potentially would have gone into effect, right around the time we were recording this podcast, but has been postponed at least a little bit, and we'll talk in a few minutes about kind of what that takes place. That's the 19th package, right? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some of the other measures, because I know, Tobias, that preventing diversion was a huge priority for the EU, and it has been for the U.S. as well. And diversion, is kind of the big the multi-million-dollar question in sanctions, because it's one thing to say nothing goes from our country to sanctioned country, or at least the things we don't want to go there. That is, it's not easy to prevent, but it is kind of, you've got fewer factors that come into play, because you can enforce your own laws in your own country a lot more easily than you can enforce them in other countries. And diversion, you don't just need to enforce, by definition, you don't need to just enforce the laws in your country. There's some other third country that is also going to need to play a role in that. And so, at least from looking at some of the new measures, it looked to me like there were, the EU is trying to enforce this by contractual clauses, and also to try and enforce it by kind of pressure on non-EU companies that are owned or controlled by companies through this best efforts doctrine. You want to talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, sure. Maybe just one clarification: that's already been in place since 2024, but of course it still plays a major role for the enforcement strategy, because maybe to give also some context, in contrast to the US, who has been very openly using secondary sanctions on third state persons and entities, the EU has always and traditionally deemed these kind of measures to be unlawful, to be an unlawful exercise of jurisdiction beyond its borders. And so they have not followed the US, actually condemned the practice, which kind of now, I think, the EU realizes backfires a bit, because they are now constantly emphasizing that they do not use extraterritorial jurisdiction, that they do not impose secondary sanctions. And yet if you look at the sanctions listings, especially in the last year, we've seen increasingly third state actors outside of Russia and Belarus joining the list of listed and sanctioned persons and oligarchs and companies. We've seen 2 Chinese banks on the list for being involved in diversion schemes. We have seen a lot of companies and traders in other countries as well, like Turkey, for example, India, and again China. So the EU has kind of adopted something that some would certainly label secondary sanctions. The EU would strongly oppose this, but it still is very similar, because actors that are not bound by EU law are sanctioned because they violate or help circumvent EU sanctions, right?
And I think the EU is running into this classic dilemma, right? And I throw it over to you in a second, Collmann, to talk about it. But it's basically, sanctions policy is much more fair when you're enforcing your own laws within your own jurisdiction and you clearly stay within your lane. Sanction that is fair, and that is traditional. That said, it's not all that effective unless you can get other countries to join, because if you're trying to put economic pressure on, say, Russia, and you cut Russia off from your economy, but Russia's not cut off from China, or Russia's not cut off even from your exports going through China to Russia, those policies are not going to be all that effective. And so what the U.S. has done over the last 15 years, which has created a lot of controversy, is try to figure out ways that extend sanctions beyond U.S. borders to make them more effective. And they often result in secondary sanctions, where there's sanctions against transactions that have no nexus to the U.S., or they're applying sanctions to companies that are foreign companies but owned or controlled by U.S. companies. Those things kind of create controversy, but they do make sanctions more effective. Now, at the one way to make sanctions effective would be to persuade every country in the world to agree to your sanctions, and then essentially that would be the most effective way. Multi-jurisdictional sanctions are the best, but if you can't do that, secondary sanctions is what the U.S. has fallen back on, and it's kind of interesting to see the EU kind of go through that learning process that the U.S. has gone through. Over to Collmann.
No, I mean, I think you're exactly right, Tim. I think once you realize how bad the diversion problem is, and you just see your products ending up in Russia and Russian weapons through third countries, it's hard not to be not to be interested in some sort of quote unquote secondary sanctions measure. And then the other thing I will say is just to defend the sort of U.S. position a little bit. The sanctions prohibitions themselves apply to U.S. persons. It's what U.S. persons are allowed to do vis-a-vis non-U.S. persons, i.e. sanctioned non-U.S. persons. So as a sort of legal matter, I think it's, U.S. sanctions have always been fairly focused on U.S. persons. They're the ones who actually have to comply. They're the ones who risk penalty or, incarceration if they get it wrong. It's just, it turns out that it's so effective to have U.S. persons, including U.S. banks, not do business with foreign persons that it sort of, it feels like an imposition of U.S. law on the foreign person.
Right. I mean, I do think we do need to be kind of, because I think the terms get blurry, but when we're talking about extraterritoriality, I think on the one hand, the U.S. view that if there is a U.S. nexus, so still primary sanctions, but if there's a U.S. nexus, we can regulate it even if the conduct takes place outside the United States. So if U.S. persons are involved or if it's export controls, U.S. goods are involved, we have jurisdiction over this. This is not quote unquote extraterritorial because we have a connection and we can keep we can take jurisdiction over this. I mean, I think at least from the US side, when we talk about secondaries, so that's one thing. And that, is not all that controversial as a matter of law, although I think people refer to it as extraterritorial exercises of jurisdiction when you have, the only U.S. nexus is that people use dollars that clear in the United States, and so the U.S. is providing some form of minimal financial services in support of the transaction, but otherwise it's a non-U.S. nexus transaction. That's still not a secondary sanction. That's a primary sanction. But in the secondary sanctions context, I mean, I think that's the one that has been the most controversial, where essentially the U.S. is saying, well, even if the conduct takes place outside U.S. jurisdiction, completely outside of your U.S. jurisdiction, we can do things about it. Now, again, the U.S. would say, I think, but all we're doing is telling our people, these folks are violating U.S. foreign policy, so U.S. persons, you can't deal with them. But it still looks a lot like we're trying to police transactions that have nothing to do with us, and I think that's what creates the controversy. But again, I mean, it makes the sanctions more effective, which is why the U.S. has pushed for that, because they've felt like they've watched themselves impose, embargoes on countries like Iran, and those embargoes kind of keep getting weaker and weaker because U.S. stuff gets to Iran through third countries. And so they're trying to figure out how is it that we can really put pressure on an economy if other countries aren't honoring our sanctions.
This is one small aside, but maybe a future podcast episode is we could have like a real international law professor or somebody who, was involved in the restatement of foreign relations law of the United States and go through the personal, it affects jurisdiction, all that stuff, and how it maps on international law. But I think that'd be
that's
very
a date.
interesting.
I think that's a date. We'll have to get Tobias back for that, and we can have kind of a theoretical discussion about extraterritorial sanctions and extraterritoriality and when it's controversial and when it's not. But for now, what's the EU doing? And has done in the last 6 months to kind of push the limits of EU sanctions beyond where they've ever really gone before.
Yeah, so the EU also takes the position that EU persons remain bound by EU sanctions, even if they are not in the EU territory. So this is similar to the US. We don't have the EU product doctrine as compared to the US. But the EU has now found some ways to kind of circumvent themselves the dilemmas of public international law by looking not directly at third country operators, but at looking at their own operators. So Tim, you already mentioned this best effort obligation. So EU companies are basically required to make sure that their subsidiaries in other countries, including, by the way, their Russian subsidiaries, which is very difficult, to abide by the Russia sanctions and the Belarus sanctions as well. So this is kind of interesting because previously we also in our practice we advise clients to, when in doubt, ring fence their subsidiaries, especially the ones in sanctioned jurisdictions, right? Because a Russian company can easily breach the EU-Russia sanctions when they purchase Russian products or when they sell to Russian customers. So we advise always in favor of a kind of hands-off approach. And now the EU has turned this on its head by saying, no, you have to actively be involved in the business of your subsidiaries and make sure, as far as factually possible and legally possible, to make sure that they comply with EU sanctions. They don't say make sure to comply, but make sure not to undermine it, whatever that means. But I mean, companies are well advised when or I think the safest option is to make sure really that they know what the EU restrictions are and that they act by it.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw that change, I had a similar thought process to what it sounds like you went through, Tobias, because it is close to impossible for a Russian company to comply with U.S. sanctions and continue to operate in Russia because of Russian law restrictions and the just predominance of SDNs. And so, that is where the U.S., it sounds like you all had the same sorts of compliance strategies, which is the U.S. sanctions against Russia apply only to U.S. persons. They didn't have, at least until very recently, didn't have any real secondary aspects of it. And so what many U.S. companies have done to comply with the sanctions against Russia, if they have foreign subsidiaries in Russia, if they have Russian subsidiaries, they would ring fence those subsidiaries. They'd essentially say U.S. persons stay out, because if U.S. persons are involved, there's almost sure to be a breach of the Russian sanctions. And so because the U.S. persons cannot participate compliantly, they're not going to participate at all, and they're not going to exercise any discretion to participate. This whole best efforts doctrine would make a mess out of that, because you can't opt out. You have to kind of go in and try and make compliant behavior happen, which seems to be close to impossible. We've had that dilemma here in the U.S., where our sanctions against Cuba and our sanctions against Iran expressly apply to subsidiaries. And because of that, what happens is you have to get out. Like, a U.S. company can't own Iranian subsidiaries. It just doesn't work, because there's no way to comply with U.S. law with your subsidiaries while you're doing business in Iran, while you're doing business in Cuba. And so the only you can't ring fence. You just get out. Except for a short period in the JCPOA where that kind of came into play in Iran, where U.S. subsidiaries potentially could go into Iran. But for now, like, if we have to make our best efforts to comply, or if we're expressly bound, if the subsidiaries are expressly bound by the same laws that the U.S. parent are bound by, you have no choice but to get out. And I would think that that's really kind of where you are in the EU. But I mean, what have companies been doing to try and comply with this obligation?
Yeah, that's very difficult in practice. I mean, especially in Russia, because, as you mentioned, you have the Russian laws, and of course you don't want to, and you actually under you also have certain limits, right? You don't have to risk your employees or your partners in Russia to be subject to criminal prosecution in Russia. So that would be a limit to the best efforts obligation.
That's
But it's been
That's the problem that I see, is that you have these employees who have been told they could go to jail for complying with certain sanctions against Russia, and you're under an obligation to make them do things that violate Russian law while they're sitting in Russia. It's not a good situation to be in.
Exactly. And so we also had clients that wanted out, but it has become extremely difficult to exit the Russian market without, not losing everything that they have there because of the Russian restrictions, because of the quote unquote voluntary payments that you have to make to the government if you want to, for example, sell your companies or your assets. Plus, you need you also need a license if you want to sell your Russian company to another Russian. You may need a license under EU law for that. So even the exit isn't that easy. So it's been a mess, frankly, how to balance all the opposing laws that are at play here.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a conference in the UK last week with a bunch of sanctions practitioners, many of whom were from the EU. And I haven't done an exit tax license case for a little while. What I learned was that apparently the Russians have now raised the exit tax. The last time I did an exit tax case, it was 20%, which meant that if you wanted to leave Russia, whatever you sold your company for, you had to give 20% to a sanctioned Russian entity, to the Central Bank of Russia, which meant you need a license to make that payment, and it was 20% to get out. Now I understand it's 55% exit tax to get out, so that essentially if you want to leave, you've got to give over half of the value of your company to a sanctioned Russian entity, and it sounds like you need a license in the EU to do that. You would need a license in the US to do that. They've made it almost impossible to leave, even if you want to leave. It's kind of the game of cat and mouse, right? The US and the EU create all sorts of incentives to leave, and the Russians create all sorts of legal incentives to make it impossible to leave. And so companies that are in this dilemma, I've had many frustrated clients who are, their question is, what am I supposed to do? Like, I can't leave and I can't stay. It's like, yeah, you've got it about right.
Can't wait to deal with this vis-a-vis China in a couple of years.
Yeah, let's hope not. I'm hoping that gets put off for at least a while. Maybe we'll all be off on a beach somewhere. And this is going to be it'll be our grandkids' problem. All right, so we talked about best efforts a little bit. I was actually very interested. This happens in the U.S., but it's not required to happen in the U.S. with respect to these no diversion clauses. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the contractual clauses and some of the requirements the EU has had with respect to diversion?
Right. So the EU has they noticed that a lot of the crucial goods used by Russia's war machine, especially if you think about parts for drones, they are diverted, but originate in the EU. So what the legislator has then done is to impose an obligation on exporters of certain sensitive goods to contractually prohibit re-export of these goods to Russia as soon as they export the goods to somewhere out of the EU, with the exclusion, by the way, of the United States and other partners, because there are similar export restrictions on Russia in place in these countries. So there's no need for a no Russia clause, or no Belarus clause, as it's called. But there's one exception, or could apply. An exception could apply if you have an EU manufacturer of these products that sells their goods to to a US company, but the US company says, okay, well, actually, please export the goods not to us in the EU, in the US, but to our end customer in a third country. And the problem the EU operator has in this regard, you have this obligation of introducing a no Russia clause to your contracts, but the EU companies, they have no contractual relationship with the end customer, right? That's a contract between the United States supplier and the end customer in, say, Turkey. And what the German ministry, at least, advised is you have to comply with the no re-export to Russia clause, and you can do that in two ways. Either you get in contact with the guy in Turkey and conclude a separate agreement to not re-export it to Russia, or you ask your US partner to do it for you. So US companies may now be requested to have a EU compliant no re-export to Russia and Belarus clause in their contracts, even though of course they are not bound by EU law. But here we see again that the EU tries to use the EU operator to sort of implement their obligations also in other countries.
So, and we have these in the United States, and in fact, I mean, we often tell clients this is best practice if you're going to be dealing with a country that's certainly a known source of diversion, that you ought to be contractually doing this. There's no requirement that folks do it, although if the item gets diverted, then and the U.S. government comes asking, that might be something that you could be faulted for if you haven't done it. So it's a more flexible. It's not a bright line rule. It's a more flexible standard, but there can be legal obligations to do this if the product gets diverted. If no diversion happens, then there's no liability under U.S. law, just because you could have had that clause. But I'm curious, does this essentially create a EU re-export rule? Because you know, at least with respect to re-exports, my understanding is that EU law may not track export controls like the US does. The US basically, once an item is subject to the EAR, it's almost always subject to the EAR. It can be transformed. There are other ways, but for the most part, exports, re-exports, transfers, the EAR applies, US export controls apply to kind of regulate what happens. I don't think the EU works quite like that, but this is actually a rule that says no re-exports to Russia, and you have to contractually make sure that that's not going to happen.
Yeah, that's right. So instead of applying their own sanctions laws, they say to the companies, please ensure contractually that the prohibitions are complied with.
So it's not secondary sanctions.
Exactly, they avoid it on paper, but of course in effect,
that's great.
It means exactly what you said. Yes,
that's great. Any thoughts on those clauses, Collmann?
I mean, I think so. They are widespread for American OEMs to have stuff like that in their, flow down clauses. There's also the sort of, if you're into esoteric EAR provisions, there's section 758.6 of the EAR, which has the destination control statement, which is language that you're required to put in a commercial invoice, sort of flagging that these items are controlled wherever they go. And I think a lot of exporters just use that, even though it's only required for certain ECCNs.
I think it's, I think if it's on the Commerce Control List, that's often required. But if it's EAR 99, it's not.
Yeah. Yes, it's not even just on the Commerce Control List. It's for a narrow subset of ECCNs. Narrow subset of
ECCNs where it's required. It's required under the ITAR for all defense articles, and it's
yes. But we do see, even for EAR 99 or AT controlled stuff, sometimes exporters just put that language in there.
Well, there's no harm to doing it because it's true even for all those other goods, but you're just required for certain goods.
Yeah. So I think the bottom line is that even though there is no U.S. sort of no Russia, no Belarus clause, there's almost a practice of similar language in any event. It's hard to enforce though if your supplier does end up. I mean, I guess it can be helpful sort of terminating a relationship with a supplier, but it's hard to deter a supplier.
Yeah, that's where I've seen it come up in the States, is if you have kind of a pretty strong no diversion clause or compliance with applicable export controls laws clause, but then you also have and if the seller has reason to believe that this isn't being followed, the seller can just terminate the contract at the seller's discretion. I've written those clauses before in various contracts, and those ones are often very helpful, where you essentially suspect that there is diversion going on. Even if you can't prove it, you can then just terminate the contract, because if you have kind of no provision for how you can terminate the contract, what winds up happening is that the party in the third country is like, what are you talking about? We didn't do anything wrong. We don't know how those products got to Iran or Russia or wherever it is. And, and I've heard folks say in Turkey, for example, they're right on the border. How can we stop these products from going there? It's not our fault. And then you get into a big fight about whether or not they breached the contract through that provision. And so if you basically, the contracts that I've seen, the more discretion that the U.S. party has, the easier it is to terminate in these circumstances, rather than going through the real difficult endeavor of proving that there's intentional diversion going on or known diversion going on.
Yeah, that's actually a great advice also for EU companies, because the no Russia clause needs to be accompanied by some sort of remedies. So contractual termination, but also penalties, and it's very difficult. I also see that problem in practice, to really prove that your contractual partner has violated a clause if they claim that they have no control over the further supply chain, right? So that could also be a very viable model for EU companies that are not as experienced in these no diversion clauses, I guess, than the US.
Yeah, in the US, it's a big problem because, the diversion is one area where export controls and sanctions are not necessarily strict liability. Because the fact is that if your product winds up in a third country, you're usually not going to be on the hook for that unless you knew or should have known that it was going to be diverted to a third country. But one of the factors as to whether or not you should have known is that, if you're selling to a country like Turkey and there's diversion to Iran, you kind of know that that is an issue going in. And if you have no provision in your contract that is aimed at that, then you're to the point where it looks like either you should have known or you're being willfully blind to kind of this diversion issue, and you just don't care about it. And so I think that is one thing that we've thought a lot about in the States, because of this potential risk and trying to avoid liability where you can avoid liability for diversion, while also taking effective measures to prevent it. And I think that, I've had clients who didn't have clauses like that, where we've learned that diversion is going on, and getting out of the contract was really hard. At the same time, like, staying in the contract created a huge amount of risk once you learn, or once you start to suspect that diversion is going on. All right. Well, I think we'll leave it there with respect to areas of divergence for now. But what about what's to come, Tobias? We basically have, the 19th package. It's ready to go. What is in it that would kind of take EU sanctions against Russia beyond where they are now and beyond where the US is?
Yeah, so according to the plans published by the Commission, it's not yet formally adopted by the by the governments of the EU member states. They meet at the Council of the EU. But we have a pretty good picture of what they plan to do. And of course, there will be further listings, as it is always the case. There will be further goods subject to export controls. We've seen that in almost every package now, that they add certain entries to these lists. But we will also see sanctions also on third country players. So they have announced to target oil refineries, traders, and petrochemical companies outside of Russia, because they continue to purchase Russian oil. So we're coming back to the point we mentioned earlier on the price gap. We see further listings of Russian banks, and that is also something that may be worth mentioning. That happened this year. So previously we've seen a lot of Russian banks excluded from the SWIFT mechanism, but they were not sanctioned as such, so you could theoretically still do transactions with them. And this SWIFT exclusion has been transformed into a full-blown transaction ban, which of course hinders payments right through these banks. We've seen an increase of the numbers of banks listed, and apparently the 19th package will add even more banks to this list. So payments will be made even more difficult now with Russia.
Well, and that also creates some of the risks that we talked about with subsidiary countries, subsidiary companies. If you have a Russian subsidiary, if the bank is just cut off from SWIFT, that's not really as much of a problem for the Russian subsidiary, because they don't need SWIFT to do transactions with that bank. But once you put the bank on the list, then the Russian subsidiary, you have to make best efforts to make sure your Russian subsidiary doesn't do any transactions with those banks. So I would guess that is also just another complication for any EU company with a Russian subsidiary.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's also worth mentioning, what's in the proposal, is sanctions on crypto platforms for the first time that were involved in sanctions circumventions, apparently. So here also we see this trend to third state operators that are being targeted. And we've also seen, although I don't know whether it made the final draft of the sanctions package, we've seen proposals to target actually Kazakhstan and introduce export controls for Kazakhstan with respect to certain items. So we've seen the provisions in place for a couple of months now, maybe even years, but they were not yet used. So we had an empty annex of the Russian regulation. But that allows the EU, or the EU allowed it itself to adopt export restrictions, sales restrictions with respect to specific goods and specific countries. And if you look at the export statistics with Kazakhstan and the EU, it's rather obvious, given the high increase since 2022, that this is a major place for diversion. So we may see export controls also in this respect now.
That is extremely interesting, to go kind of directly at export controls on Kazakhstan. I mean, understandable. You want to jump in here, Collmann? Because I think you might know something about this topic.
Yeah, no, I feel like Kazakhstan is always sort of misunderstood. It always seems, every person I've met from Kazakhstan is super nice, and it seems like Kazakhstan is trying to be on the right side of history here. And I do think that the big diversion problem to Russia is not Kazakhstan, it's China, by sort of an order of magnitude. But I will say that there's sort of two big issues in Kazakhstan. The first is the Eurasian Customs Union. So they're sort of in a NAFTA with Russia. And the second is it's
just to tease that out a little bit, Collmann, my understanding is that goods can go from Kazakhstan to Russia without ever passing through customs, right? So essentially, if you send something to Kazakhstan, there's really no restriction on it being transferred to Russia. At least there's no, I mean, there might be a legal restriction on it, but as a practical matter, you can just drive it across the border. And it's not like even an export. It's like, sending something from Virginia to Maryland.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there's also a bigger issue, which is, let's say you wanted to drive some legitimate goods to Kazakhstan. Just looking at a map, you could drive through Iran, which we wouldn't want to do. You could drive through China, which is another risk area, or especially if you're coming from Europe, you have to drive through Russia. So there's this whole sort of, you can put the goods on the trucks in Bulgaria or Turkey, and then you can drive them to Kazakhstan, but at some point you'll go through Russian territory, and it's just super easy for them to kind of fall off the truck there. And if you if you delve into kind of public trade data, you do see this reflected in some very interesting trade patterns. You see millions of dollars of cars purportedly leaving Turkey bound for Kazakhstan, and then them not received by not showing up in the Kazakh customs data. So it's I think the government of Kazakhstan is trying to do the right thing, but I think that the geography is just really tough.
Yeah, the geography and just past trade agreements, I think, make both difficult.
And the economic integration with Russia.
Right. Right.
So,
all right, Tobias, back to you. I know that was one of the new issues with respect to the 19th package, but what else is out there?
So we don't know the full. We don't have the full picture yet, but we've seen. I think this is I mentioned the most important points would be probably the third country operators involved in oil, the deadline for the exit from Russian LNG imports. We talked about that previously, and we will have another transaction ban also on Russian energy companies Rosneft and Gazprom Neft. So these are the measures explicitly mentioned by the Commission.
So increase on energy sanctions, increase on financial sanctions, and more measures to stop diversion. Those are coming soon to a EU Council initiative near you, apparently. Well, maybe.
Exactly.
We'll see.
Right.
We'll see if they can get 27 votes for that. All right. Well, anything else to talk about with respect to EU-US divergence or any other issues you want to put on the table, Tobias, before we sign off?
Yeah, maybe we can briefly mention, given the timing, that we will probably see more Iran sanctions soon, because the Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, they have initiated almost a month ago, the so-called snapback mechanism under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So given that we have seen no agreement between or with Iran, and given the continued violation by Iran of their obligations when it comes to the nuclear program, I expect that the EU will have to, under the UN Charter obligations, reimpose the Iran sanctions that were suspended due to the agreement. And this will mean, of course, more alignment with the US.
Yeah, that's more convergence there.
Exactly. Even though, of course, the US goes beyond the initial UN sanctions, but you know that better than me. Even though, that said, I think that the EU will have to quickly reinstate many of the sectoral and personal sanctions that we saw prior to the agreement.
So the final nail in the coffin of the JCPOA, I think, is coming soon. It sounds like. We'll
Probably,
see.
yeah.
We'll see what follows. I mean, I think, at least my recollection, it's been a while since I read it carefully, but my recollection is that a lot of the obligations were going to expire in 2025 anyway. And so, but the snapback now seems to have been triggered by what Iran was doing. I mean, I think it was more complicated than that in a sense, because the JCPOA kind of, at least from the US side, died in 2018. And so I think Iran felt like it wasn't getting the benefit of its bargain, so it wasn't bound by the rest of it. But it did stay in the agreement with the EU and the UK until now. And so it seems like the kind of final chapter is going to be with Iran having changed its behavior. The EU and the UK are going to come back and snap back, which I don't think was how anyone envisioned snapback originally, but it is where we are. All right. Well, on that note, anything else before you head back to the EU, at least at some point relatively soon, Tobias?
No, I think much will depend on how when it comes to Russia, much will depend on the US administration, how they move forward. If the EU is left alone with their enforcement, we will probably see more non-secondary sanctions, which are, however, secondary sanctions, light perhaps. And we will certainly
contractual
see more
secondary sanctions.
Yes, and we will certainly see pressure on EU companies to increase their due diligence and their compliance.
Collmann, last word.
I mean, don't forget the possibility of a kinetic conflict between NATO and Russia, which I don't know if that's. That's not outside the realm of possibility, and I think that would obviously change everything.
Well, on that optimistic note, I think we're going to leave it there. It's been great having you in Washington, Tobias, and enjoy the rest of your time in North America. And we hope to talk to you when you're back in the EU and back safely in Berlin. And for the rest of you listeners,
thank you.
It was great having you. For the rest of the listeners, stay sanctions free, and we'll talk to you soon.
Produced by Heartcast Media.